Welcome to the Soul Science Nutrition Podcast, where you'll discover that when it comes to your health, you're so much more powerful than you've been led to believe. And now, your host. She's a holistic nutrition and lifestyle coach, chef, author, and yogi, Christine O'Casey.
Hello, and welcome to the Soul Science Nutrition Podcast. I'm Christine O'Casey. Thanks so much for tuning in today. On today's special show, we're going to dive into the gut-brain connection. We're going to learn how to harness the power of that biological link between our mind and our gut to take charge of our health. You see, there's an explosion of research happening now that suggests that restoring our gut health will be one of the key drivers of 21st century medicine. When it comes to optimizing our health, we really can't overemphasize the importance of a healthy gut. Hippocrates once said, "All disease begins in the gut." Today's rise in obesity, brain disease, autoimmune disease, mental disorders can all be linked to an altered microbial health in the wake of huge changes in our diet, lifestyle, and food system. While ancient healing traditions like traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda have long understood that complexity of the interaction between our brain, our mind, and our gut, Western medicine has been slow to depart from its mechanistic view of the human body. But in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a microbiome revolution, which is embracing a more accurate and complex model of the human body as an ecosystem, where microbiota, trillions of microorganisms that live inside our digestive tract, are giving us a whole new appreciation for the complex relationship between food, mood, emotions, and metabolism, and more. Health really is a function of this gut-brain axis. Think of the gut-brain axis as a powerful way to build your understanding of the mind-body connection. So I am so excited for today's guest. I have Dr. Emeran Meyer. He's a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and author of the best-selling book, The Mind-Gut Connection. Dr. Meyer has been studying this brain-gut axis for over 40 years. He's a professor of medicine and executive director of the UCLA Center for the Neurobiology of Stress. Dr. Meyer offers a revolutionary and provocative look at this developing science. His research on how the tiny microbes in our gut communicate with our brain show how an unbalanced communication system can give rise to a wide variety of health issues, affecting our physical, emotional, and mental well-being. Dr. Meyer is here to teach us how to harness the power of the mind-gut connection so we can take charge of our health and learn to listen to the innate wisdom of our bodies. Hello, Dr. Meyer. Welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you here today.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, thank you. So let's just dive in. The ever-growing body of research in the last 15 to 20 years, the discussion of the gut-brain axis has become a little bit more mainstream. Nonetheless, I think it's really important that we get your perspective to start this call with why you believe it's so important to embrace this model of our bodies as an ecosystem.
So it's always been something that has fascinated me, and I can't even tell you, if it has to do that I've grown up in a family of chocolate makers, and then abandoned that path and got to medical school. So there's always been sort of this diet, culinary taste environment for my first 15 years of life. The thing that fascinated me most about health and disease is this mind-body connection from the beginning. So this was debated between psychiatry and medicine. Psychiatry was at the time too strange for me, quite honestly. So it did not relate to my primary interest, didn't have the body in it. Mm-hmm. And then I sort of pursued this pathway and created my own path because this was not something that was, mainstream medicine either. So it was carving a path with very few allies and people that found that interesting. And then, it homed into the brain-gut axis because from my clinical experience, I felt that patients that have GI problems have a particularly extensive, mind component to their disease. For most physicians, certainly for most gastroenterologists, that's invisible. To my surprise, still today, I still can't believe that. But so this continued to, and until about 10 years ago, I was totally immersed in this brain gut research in animals and in cells and in humans. And about 10 years ago, the Microbiome Revolution started, and then that obviously became a very important component to it. I thought I could explain pretty much everything I saw in the clinic, even without the microbiome. But what the microbiome introduced is the link to diet and food that, to the.
Yes, thank you. It is kind of shocking how even in today's, very well-versed world in this, that you can still kind of hit a roadblock with conventional approaches to metabolic issues or digestive issues. It's a little frustrating. So yeah. And I love the way that you say the mind-body connection is not an idea. It's a biological fact, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's nothing psychological. It's as biological as any other disease or any other aspect of our health and wellness. I should also say, ever since I published my first book and was exposed to audiences that I normally would have never talked to, with all the speaking engagements, so this has even intensified this conviction that the brain-gut axis and the role of the microbiome are a core component of our overall system, of our overall network. And it appears, so in my new book, I deal with this a lot, that a lot of diseases that we don't necessarily link together or link to the gut or link to the microbiome are all now, evidence is accumulating that they are related to disturbances. And so for me, it's not so much, like obesity and the cosmetic aspects of that. It's really, we're in the midst of a public health crisis. Yes. That is, it's almost like normalized to, people are too obese, they have to do more exercise. But it's much more than that. I mean, it's something like this has really never happened in that dimension before. How many people are affected and increased risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes and brain disorders and cognitive decline. So seeing that all these are somehow connected to these brain-gut microbiome interactions, that's still, it's a fascinating idea.
It's such important work. It really is getting to the root cause of so much of our health, individual health, and certainly public health concerns. But let's just back up a second. How does the brain in our gut talk to the brain in our head?
So there's like everything that happens within the brain-gut axis is bidirectional. So our big brain can send signals to the little brain in the gut when it's necessary, and the little brain, even though that's less well established, has ways to feed back to the brain. What's important about this, our it's enteric nervous system is the proper name for this little brain in our gut, about 100 million neurons, with very similar design principles and neurotransmitters as the big brain. Mm-hmm. And that system has evolved for literally millions of years and is present in almost every animal. So it's a very ancient system, and which has developed primarily for digestion, for peristalsis and secretion and regulating the speed of transit through the gut. Our big brain has evolved from the enteric nervous system, has used the same blueprints, but it deals with a lot more. It deals with the environment, people around us, making predictions about what's going to happen, threat assessments. And it leaves the little brain pretty much alone for most of the time. The little brain doesn't really need the input from the brain.
Okay.
It's only if something happens that the little brain would not really know about or needs to be reminded. So like a threat, a physical threat, fight and flight response, that's when the big brain sends down signals to change gut function. But normally, if you have a healthy gut, it operates, you could disconnect it from the brain, which they've done in mouse models, and it works, perfectly well. Signaling from the little brain to the big brain is a little bit more complicated. I think what we know the best is the little brain can regulate gut function, contractions, and then with all these sensors we have in our gut, that vagal nerve endings that then feed back this information about increased tension or compression or pressure, that feeds back to the brain. There's probably also chemical communication, but it's less well understood than the top-down influence.
Okay. So, I'm getting the understanding that it's helpful to see our body, right, as sort of a communication system. I mean, we're housed in this physical organism, but the essence of health, when we look at gut-brain axis, is this bi-directional communication system. And when we have faulty communication or disruptive communication in some way, that creates a disease state or puts us at more higher risk for certain dysfunction, right?
Yeah, and I could give you one example that probably very few people think about. So any bidirectional communication system with feedback loops is not static. It always oscillates, because if one thing changes and the other side adapts to it and feeds back, and so you have these oscillations, and every healthy system shows oscillations. So if a system loses these, either changes the frequency of the oscillations or loses them completely, that's an early sign of a decline of the health, and it puts people at increased risk. So, one of the most well-known variations is the diurnal variation. So day and night, sleep and waking time. And the gut follows that quite closely, and the microbes follow that quite closely.
Yes.
And there's recent evidence that, a disturbance of that rhythm will affect microbial function and microbial interaction with the gut, and is a risk factor for development of metabolic syndrome, for example.
Yes.
So this is something that you wouldn't necessarily know. You just would say, I'm not sleeping well, or I have to take a sleeping pill. But this has a lot more serious consequences, because it will affect the whole, brain-gut axis, with secondary effects on virtually every aspect of the body.
Yes. And in the same manner, when people say, oh, I just have some constipation, or I'm feeling bloated, and that really is kind of what they consider to be their normal. For me, I know it's a red flag, right? Because again, it's dealing with such a delicate and important system in our body. Like you said, it has wide-reaching effects in all our systems. When it comes to the role of psycho-emotional stress impacting the function, the communication system, or affecting the composition of the ecosystem, right? What's going on there? What's going on with modern day stress, just life stress?
Yeah, so acute stress, there's tons of studies, and our group and collaborators have pursued this for a long time, it goes back more than 100 years. Investigators have looked at this. So with a fight and flight response, you clearly have a component of the gut. There's, that's an extreme sort of life-threatening situation where everything within our body is altered, preparing us, optimizing us for either fighting or running away, optimizing musculoskeletal activity and compromising GI function. So that doesn't really happen that often. When we talk about stress today, and this fight and flight response is an ancient response. If you didn't have it, mankind would have died out a long time ago.
Yes.
So this our current problem is the chronic low-grade persistent stress, which has really not happened in evolution to any degree like this.
Yes.
If it does happen, for example, if you see it, there's general what we call maladaptive responses. You see it in animals, animals in a zoo or in a circus. I mean, they're not, they perform, but they're not really healthy because they're under chronic stress.
Yes. So how does that affect the activity of our microbiome or the the microorganisms?
Anything that happens in our brain, the gut is a mirror image, and the gut is the mirror image, but the gut sets the context or the habitat in which the microbes live. So the microbes sense that as well. So it's changing their home that they live in. It changes the rate of transit through the gut. But importantly, it also has a direct effect that the stress mediators like norepinephrine have a direct effect on the microbes. So they leak into the gut and affect the behavior of the microbes. So when you're under chronic stress, you have a different gut and you have different microbes, and it's not good for you. So it's not good for your heart, but it's also not good for your gut. And in a simple way, if you're under significant chronic stress, you will develop similar kind of changes in your gut and your gut microbiome as you would develop on an unhealthy diet. So increase of permeability, low-grade immune activation. So you can imagine if you're on a chronic stress and are on an unhealthy diet, which applies to a lot of people in our society, it puts you at a very high risk for, any of the metabolic, any of the brain gut microbiome diseases, even at a high risk, in my opinion, for these COVID-19 outcomes. So it's not causing it. It's not causing it, but it increases the risk of having a more severe or more serious.
So it compromises your immune system, right? But explain the link between that and this. You talk about low-grade inflammation, right? Which keeps people in this kind of pre-disease states. How much we weigh and necessarily body shape, not necessarily the most comprehensive, accurate telltales for a person in optimal health. So because of the time, right, this can take to simmer and fester and then manifest. So explain the link, if you would, please, the effect of this chronic long-term stress on the activity in our microbiome and inflammation.
So it changes, what we call the relative abundances of microbes. So certain, like Lactobacilli, the relative abundance of them goes down, the percentage that they have on the overall system. So Lactobacilli have an effect on tryptophan metabolism. And so if you decrease the number of these Lactobacilli, it affects the tryptophan metabolism, creating potentially harmful metabolites from dietary tryptophan that then affect, nerve function. Some of these metabolites are being absorbed, can make it to the brain, can have neurodegenerative and neuroinflammatory effects. We're really just at the beginning of, it's a very complex, as you can imagine, a very complex system. You have hundreds of thousands of microbial strains and species that are affected, that interact with each other. So for example, the Lactobacilli produce hydrogen peroxide, and they produce that because it's a way of establishing and defending their niche in the ecosystem of the gut. That hydrogen peroxide has also other effects, I think today, if we understand maybe hard to give a number to that, maybe 5% of the system. I think that would be a realistic number. And you can imagine, I mean, like all these extrapolations that people make, you know, you have to eat more of this to increase the number of your lactobacilli, or it's really naive, because it's the ecosystem. You know, you want to know what all these thousands of organisms, how they interact and talk to each other, how that is affected. And that's much harder to, we're just beginning really now to use technologies to measure that, you know, so.
Thank you. So, you know, to your point, there's a lot of, you know, people saying, you know, you should be taking probiotics. And I'm talking about supplementation right now, you know, and or prebiotic supplementation, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Difficult to answer. You know, I mean, there have been recently critical articles and critical recommendations by the American Gastroenterological Association that for GI diseases, probiotics are really not, they can be used in clinical trials, but they cannot be recommended based on their on clinical evidence, on sufficient clinical evidence. That remains a real problem. You know, I think that the regular intake of microbial organisms that are associated with the diet also goes back, you know, tens of thousands of years. People
fermented
foods.
Yes.
People developed this to preserve food because they didn't have refrigerators. Yeah. And I'm convinced everything like this takes about 15,000 years for some dietary intervention to cause permanent or genetic or epigenetic changes. Mm. So I would predict that this intake of naturally fermented food had an effect on our gut genetics, which then would mean it's a good thing if you continue to do that. Now, if those commercially available Lactobacilli strains are the best ones, that has not really been answered, because we don't have those high quality clinical trials that you would need to approve a medication. But I certainly would always recommend people to increase the amount of naturally fermented foods of different sources in their diet. I think our human gut is adapted to that.
Yes. And frankly, almost every culture, excluding the Western culture, it's always been an indigenous food source. Very much part of the culture. Thank you. So going back to what you mentioned around the mirror in the gut, you actually say in your book, all emotions have a mirror in the gut, right? So explain that a little bit. That's fascinating.
Yeah, because of this close connection through the autonomic nervous system and the sensory nerves that go from the gut to the brain, any emotional expression in the brain is associated with, you know, neurotransmitter release and activation of distinct emotion-specific patterns. So anger, fear, anxiety. It hasn't been studied as much for positive emotions, but I have no doubt that this will also have a distinct pattern of autonomic outflow to the body. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of that's the link. If you have this emotion that starts in your brain, it will then affect the gut and the microbes. Mm-hmm. The microbes then will produce chemicals that some of which can feed back to the brain. And the question is, we don't know this 100%. Does it reinforce the emotion? Is that one of the reasons why when you're in a bad mood, why it sticks around so long? Mm. You know, you can't get rid of it. This would be a typical effect, you know, this feedback loop through the body, which is slow.
Yes.
And but potentially, you know, and we probably know less about that. I mean, can the emotion come from the gut primarily? You know, can it? So if you eat certain foods, would that affect your emotional makeup, and then, you know, the cycle would start in the gut and it goes to the brain. So Dan Barber, you know, with this this ultimate taste.
Yes.
So that would start in the gut or maybe in the mouth, because of the taste receptors.
Yes.
And then it would make its way up to the brain. I think that if you have a system like that has two different entry points and two different components, I think things can start at either end of the system.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I think it's useful to understand there is that feedback loop, which from a practical standpoint means that from an emotional regulation standpoint, we have a few ways in. We have the dietary component, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we certainly have the psychological, meditative mind component, right? So it's,
and then there's always this, I've always been a big fan of the abdominal breathing technique, because it's so easy to do and because it's so effective. And you can literally feel, how it affects the warmth in your abdomen and which is obviously the blood flow. And so that's another way. I mean, we don't know what happens during that intervention to the microbes, but we certainly know it has a positive, emotional anti-stress effects. And I would bet my money on it that it's linked to a gut component as well, and a microbial component.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And when we do abdominal or deep belly breathing, how does it affect, isn't there some interaction with the vagus nerve? It sort of strengthens or activates the vagus nerve. So maybe there's a communication.
Yeah, the vagus nerve plays a big role. Both at the gut level, but also from the diaphragm, the diaphragm has a vagal innervation. So if you affect the pattern of breathing, you get a different activation pattern of the vagus nerve, which then the brain perceives as being relaxed. So it can't, this is actually a good example, how much the brain has learned to listen to the body. Because if you're really good in this abdominal breathing, you will override what your brain might come up with in terms of stress and anxiety. And so you can actually do that.
Yeah, that's powerful. Again, going back to some of the brilliant design of the body, which is why, I'm just fascinated by the mind-body connection. It's profound. So the gut-brain axis, one of the things that the microbiota, you talk about is we sort of have our own built-in pharmacy, the production of GABA, the production of serotonin, oxytocin, right? All these healing things, chemicals in the body that produce well-being, which happen to be something that the pharmaceutical industry is trying very hard to replicate, right? How can we, I think it's really important for people to understand that we actually have that built in to us. So from a lifestyle, self-care standpoint, what guidance would you have or what insights would you have to help people understand that there's actually some more, beautiful healing capabilities within them?
Well, two things to that. One is we clearly have it built into our system, and teaching people skills, of mindfulness, meditation, are obviously extremely powerful. I would say they're more powerful in a pre-disease state, and they mobilize. We know a lot what they mobilize within the brain: oxytocin and the endorphins, opioids. We also now know that this is always associated with microbial production of. So this whole serotonin story, which is a fascinating story, that the microbes play a very big role in the synthesis of serotonin in our gut. So if we can influence this with our mind is one question, but we certainly can influence it if we realize we don't just have this pharmacy in our bodies, but it's available in our food. So, plant-based food is obviously the biggest pharmacy on the planet. And it's pretty much free for most people that eat to survive. It's an added benefit. Interesting to me that people are more willing to pay money for all kinds of supplements and expensive medications. Where it's all out there. You just have to really. You have to be to become aware, and you have to know how to take advantage of it.
Yes, thank you. So let's dive into food. So when it comes to keeping our microbiota, functioning and happy, and it all boils down to really that's what it is. We're feeding them so that they can do the right thing for us, right? In many ways.
Exactly.
What would be your considerations, around food? I mean, there's just a lot of noise, and you go through some really brilliant insights into vegetarian, gluten-free, keto, paleo, traditional diets. How it can be very overwhelming. So how can we support a healthy gut, with just a handful of recommendations?
Yeah, I would say, if you're healthy, it's the easiest thing that you can imagine. I think there's overwhelming evidence that a largely, not necessarily exclusive, but a largely plant-based diet provides you the highest amount of health, gut health promoting molecules.
Mm-hmm.
On top of the list being dietary fiber and polyphenols, mm-hmm. And then some plant-based fats, the omega-3s. So there's absolutely no question that if you're healthy, if you want to live the longest, evidence for all of these is available. And I personally don't even understand why there's an argument, why there's in a discussion where some people would tell you, right. You have to live from animal fat and meat in order to stay healthy. It just makes absolutely no sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you have a disease, it's somewhat different. So, yeah. Well, before I get into this, let me say one thing to this also. It's not just what you eat; it's also how you eat it.
Yes.
So, there's a lot of emphasis recently on time-restricted eating and on intermittent fasting. Very interesting story how that affects the microbes and how the microbes interact with our gut. Mm-hmm. I personally, based on the literature, I think any kind of fasting is not really sustainable for over a year. The great 90% of studies show that it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. Maybe for monks for spiritual reasons that they can do that, but not the
modern
ordinary
day,
person.
right?
Not modern day. And but the time restricted eating, where you compress the time where you expose the microbes to food and leave them a lot more time without this task of breaking down food, seems to have the same benefits as a ketogenic diet may have. Or that fasting may have, but without the downsides. And it's relatively easy to implement. Everybody can do that. We've done it in our family, and it takes a couple of weeks to get used to it, and you have to change some of your daily routines, but ultimately it's not a huge challenge. Mm-hmm. Now, coming to the diseases, if you have, for example, if you have irritable bowel syndrome and you suffer a lot from bloating, you have to, I think this is what I recommend my patients, still start out with the largely plant-based diet, but then customize it for you personally by reducing or eliminating food items that consistently worsen your symptoms. And consistently, that's an important part. If it works once but not the second time, it's probably not the food, it's something else. The good thing is then you have that patient is empowered. They have learned to develop their own diet, and it works really well. You don't have to go on the low FODMAP diet, and after 4 weeks, then reintroduce food. It's just not necessary.
That's really empowering to hear that.
Yes. So then, and I'm probably one of the very few gastroenterologists who would say that, because once something like this, like the low FODMAP diet, gets incorporated into the guidelines that the society issues, everybody will do it. It becomes like religion, you know.
And it becomes very restrictive in a psychological sense, which does not promote healing. I found it actually already enhances the whole stress that's going on with someone who's struggling with symptom.
Absolutely, and it suppresses anxiety. Any ritual around your diet, obviously, you know, doesn't resolve but suppresses anxiety, which then finds another way of. So yeah, I mean, it has to start with eating has to be a pleasurable experience, and should not be associated with any kind of stress related to how you eat and what you eat. You know, it's so.
Yes.
I mean, there's other diseases. There's obviously celiac disease. You have to be on a gluten-free diet. That's not even a point to argue about.
Right.
If a gluten-free diet is good for people who don't have celiac disease is a whole other question. I personally think that's another one of those unnecessary restraints that people put on themselves. Some people, like in my practice, some people say yes, they felt better when they went on a gluten-free diet. Some people say they lost their brain fog. Even colleagues of mine.
Yes.
And so we don't know the whole story about the non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But I think there's a lot more to it. It's a processed food that you know, if you eat a gluten-free diet, you eliminate a lot of other things that may be responsible for that. But this whole multi-billion-dollar industry that has you know, evolved just because somebody wrote a book about it and recommended that it solves every conceivable medical problem, which this phenomenon is a huge problem in our society now. You know, as you said earlier, the confusion.
Yes.
So somebody comes up with a book like this, and the media jump on it because they want sensational things. They think recommending a plant-based diet is not interesting, you know. Right. But eliminating gluten is exciting, you know.
And it's that gadget, you know. You know, one size fits all type thing, and it sells well. The science is really clear that we have an incredibly beautifully designed, very complex, you know, system that we operate in, and there's a degree of, we can understand connections and correlations, but there's such a degree of personalized experience when it comes to our health state, right? What more specific or individualized can it get with regard to our microbiome? It's kind of like it's like a fingerprint almost, right? It's so specific. So I love the fact that you want to basically you want to empower people in their health to appreciate the complexity, but with that comes the responsibility of paying attention to what's going on in your own body, right? And really doing the work of becoming more self-aware of, to your point, emotions and sensory experiences, because they're really important, right?
Yes.
So my question for you is, you know, when it comes to a lot of these tests that look at all the strains in our gut, and they do these leaky gut panels. This is like a really, you know, big area of medicine right now. Is that useful? I mean, I don't mean it's not a simple yes or no question, but when a lot of my clients will go down that functional diagnostic testing and trying to manipulate different strains, and I'm notwithstanding parasites and viruses, you know, and that kind of stuff. How, where's the science on that for you?
It's very, the way it's promoted by the functional medicine community, I think is very shaky. I mean, it's a very shaky ground. It's oversimplified. I mean, obviously it's all geared towards making money, you know, doing the tests and then selling supplements. And this is the unfortunate thing, you know, they criticize regular medicine, but in reality, but in reality they have the same business model, you know, just to charge for something else. And I'm a big skeptic of that. I think our current technologies to assess gut permeability I mean, the gut is leaky to start out with, because it can absorb large molecules, and
Yes.
so there's different degrees of permeability. Not everything is negative. Some of these mechanisms that give the immune system more access to what goes on inside the gut are probably adaptive. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them. So I'm very skeptical. So yeah, most of my patients come with these test results now, and
Yes.
and I generally, out of politeness, I look at them, but I always tell them
they're not very helpful from taking action, right? Because it's not a one-to-one.
No, it's not a one.
Yeah. Okay.
And by far the best. I mean, it's I'm sure you're totally aware of this. I mean, a highly varied diet with as many different types of fruits and vegetables, and certain types of fish provides you the ideal combination. So I like this. It's just almost like traditional Chinese medicine. It was always combinatorial. They don't give one substance to cure one thing. They give a mixture of things. Some are stimulatory, others inhibitory.
Yeah.
How they came up with this, I have no idea, but I'm sort of gravitating to that kind of system, and that you can do this with eating plant-based food. You can vary it by the season. You can vary it what you eat in the morning, what you eat in the evening. Part of it is, because there's not too many studies on that, is experimentation. What makes you feel better personally? Because, and as you said, the individualized gut microbiome that we only share, less than 10% of the organisms with our neighbor, that gives credence to that you individualizing it for yourself. I mean, you don't need the tests really. I think you need to look at your well-being. Do you feel better if you eat more or less of this particular vegetable, or if you eat it?
Well, I can't tell you how that's music to my ears, because that's really how the success that I've worked with people is really putting the power and the responsibility and the accountability back in their hands. So I think that makes so much sense once again. And when it comes to intuition, right? Because that's what we're really talking about here. We're the ability to trust our gut, right? Mm-hmm. Even especially when it comes to just what works for me in my health plan. How can we increase our intuition? I love the science that you bring up about what happens when we go to sleep, and our microbiota are actively working with those emotions. Can you just share your insights on that, intuition and health?
Like in many areas of science, we don't have the full answer. What we say today, I'm sure in 50 years from now, people are going to laugh about it. But an intuitive person who is in touch with their body and their gut, and listens to their gut, and doesn't do things when it doesn't feel right, in general, is a healthier person. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned in my book, so this mechanism may be negatively biased early on in life. If a lot of bad things happened, then this system basically operates always on a certain level of alarm. And you make exaggerated judgments. So you're afraid of things that you don't really need to be afraid of. If you had a happy childhood, and if you don't have this biasing of your system, I think the more you learn, and sometimes it's certainly not taught in school, and it's not, many parents don't teach it. I mean,
no, not the society here, right?
Like career decisions are almost never based on that gut feeling. They're based on how much money. So parents want their children to make as much money as possible and be as successful. So they get this advice that often is not compatible with. So I think as a society, we're doing really poorly with that. And I think many traditional societies are much better in doing this. So can we learn it? Yes, I do believe that if you go on this path of first the awareness of this complex system. It is
Yes.
very powerful. We can influence our own health and happiness by it. I think once you go down this path, becoming more aware and receptive to your intuition is a very important component.
Yes. Of healing and being in the driver's seat, right, of your health. Okay, so you said in your book that we are in a watershed moment in human physiology, and there's a lot to that, but is this paradigm or this mind-body shift, is it becoming more widely embraced? Is there traction in the public health model? What are you seeing?
I think there is progress, certainly compared to when I started my medical training, where I felt like I seem to be the only person who actually believes in that and sees it. I think what's happening today is this sort of increasing split between like the specialties where people become technologists, very sophisticated, like in my own specialty.
Yes.
There's more and more sophisticated techniques, endoscopies, endoscopic surgeries. So that moves further and further away from that holistic model. But then, for example, in our division at UCLA, we have a very innovative, visionary division chief who has created this section of wellness, and with psychologists, with dietitians, and so that deals with the other aspects. So it's kind of split. The physicians are not trained in that because they select the specialties to make as much money as possible, which is cardiology and gastroenterology.
Yes.
And those become more and more technical.
Yes,
ultimately, and ultimately those things will be done by robots anyway, so it's just a matter of time. But on the other hand, there is now more and more academic centers that establish these wellness centers within their, so I think that's a big step forward. And I think the brain gut microbiome axis has helped a lot. I mean, the number of review articles that I've written on this topic for textbooks now, and
that's wonderful.
That will ultimately change students, and trainees' mindset. There's something more than, just cutting out a piece of gut if you have belly pain. It's.
All right. Well, right on. I hope so. That would be awesome. That would be progress in a world that really needs to move in that direction. So, Emeran, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been a gift, and I hope we can continue this conversation. There's just a world of knowledge and insight, and I'm going to promote and highly, highly recommend your book. It is a must-have on everybody.
Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. I'm so glad to know you.
It was great talking to you. Yeah.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And for my listeners, you definitely want to explore the work of Dr. Mayer at emeranmayer.com and pick up The Mind-Gut Connection, that best-selling Amazon book that is such a powerful resource for you. You can get that on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And of course, I'll post everything in the show notes. So thank you again so much for listening. Bye for now.